he's a very inspirational individual for me personally. So he's the co-founder and CEO of Holition, and they're a creative studio which works with the likes of, Hermes, Louis Vuitton, and all those kind of really illustrious brands you find on Bond Street. It's the easiest way to describe it. But I know that Jonathan will do a better job of describing what he does himself. So without further ado, Jonathan Chippindale, please come over.
Good job for me. Carry on. Right, let's have a go at this. Just hands up, first of all. I'm completely frazzled. We've had a major emergency going on in the studio today. We're doing a favor for an American luxury brand. And that favor is doing one of those 4D anamorphic billboards. I don't know whether you know the ones. The big one in Piccadilly Circus. We're doing one in Times Square. You can create content that looks three-dimensional, even though it's not actually three-dimensional. It's on a two-dimensional board. And it's for a fragrance launch tomorrow. And we had done a lot of CGI and rendered this thing out. And at 6 in the morning, I had a phone call from New York saying that they made an absolute screw-up, and the 2 bottles that we spent 2 weeks CGIing were actually prototypes from a completely different fragrance launch. And we were given 7 hours we're currently CGIing it now. When I left the studio, all I could hear was someone shouting, "That one's gilt, that one's silver." So I thought I'd better just get the hell out. But we're rendering it. The issue is the screen is 87, Americans work in feet, 87 feet tall and 190 feet wide, which is a lot of feet. It's 17,000 feet. That's a lot of pixels. So the quality of the film is huge. It's going to take all evening to render. It's got to be in New York at 9 o'clock, so I will run off after this. Apologies. So clearly my ability to influence brands is negligible. So I'm not an influencer, and this is not a space that I particularly know well. To be honest, I'm not really sure what I am and what Holition does. I should do, because obviously it's my studio. I and 2 colleagues founded it 18 years ago, 19 years ago, something along those lines, before the iPhone was launched, before Twitter was invented, and when Facebook had 1.2 million users, and you had to be an academic to get onto their network, because it was originally a network used for managing universities. Some people call us creative technologists. Anna referred to us as creative technologists. I can understand that, because we very much play in that middle ground where kind of art meets science, that cultural space. A lot of this is about storytelling and using technology to amplify, to create stories. Because in the end, what is a brand if it's not a collection of stories? Stories about product, craftsmanship, heritage. You guys are influencers. You tell those stories using those channels. We use technology to tell, a whole range of different stories. And with that in mind, it's and this will be a theme, I think, of the next 10 minutes, none of it is about the technology for us. We're very interested in strategy, tone of voice, personality. We then think about creative ideas to unlock that strategy. Again, I think this is very similar to you guys, right? Thinking of great creative ideas to tell stories. And if we do that well, then the right technology just self-selects itself. So we're technology last. And as a result of that, we work across a very, very wide range of different types of technologies, all of which we build ourselves in our studio around the corner with my 38 great colleagues and the 2 dogs that we were referring to, computer scientists, data scientists, artists, filmmakers, animators, psychologists, anthropologists, and producers that hold it all together. Now, and some of those projects could be a fashion show for Louis Vuitton, or a fashion show for Burberry, or a fashion show for Tommy Hilfiger, but we do store windows for brands, we build wearables, we do data visualizations, we build social media filters, we do a lot of work in virtual try-on, particularly in beauty, for brands like L'Oreal and brands like Charlotte Tilbury. But again, all about storytelling, not about the technology. Now, my background, hello, more up here. Oh, look, it works if I stop shouting. Great. So my background is a luxury marketing director. And when I started out in my career, older and wiser people beat into me the fundamentals of marketing, which was everything is about the consumer. Really, really focus on the consumer and don't do anything as a brand unless it's fundamentally aligned against the consumer. And there's been an interesting thing with the brands that we work with in technology. Maybe it's changing now, but I think a lot of our brands have been more sort of interested in the idea of technology rather than necessarily what the story is or the meaning of those, of why you're using that technology. Technology is often accused of being a solution, looking for a problem to solve. I've just come back from Vivitech in Paris, which is the big luxury tech conference. All sorts of interesting ideas, many of them very clever. Umbrellas that know when it's raining, L'Oreal's new hairbrush that tells you how to brush your own hair. These things are interesting, they're clever, but are they actually hitting an actual consumer need? I'm not totally sure. i.e. brands have been very, very slow to engage with digital. When we started, it was all about the weight of the Rolex watch. It was all about the stitchery in the Birkin bag. And digital was seen to be way too impersonal a channel to talk about everything that luxury believed in. Again, those stories we were talking about earlier, history, craftsmanship, heritage, service, the thickness of the carpet in a store, everything that luxury was delivering in store, digital was seen to be something that was just not for them, democratizing luxury, and therefore will not get involved with it. And actually, one of the very first meetings that I ever had as founder of Holition was with a gentleman called Bernard Fournard, who was managing director of Cartier and went on to become chief executive of the Richemont Group. And he famously, I sat in his office, his imperial office in Geneva, and he told me that, Jonathan, this is interesting, but until somebody can demonstrate to me that the internet will still be here in 3 years, Cartier will not go away and do anything mad and crazy and digital. And that's very much where the kind of bar was set. So one of the things I think has been very interesting about the onset of digital and the impact it's had on luxury fashion and beauty brands has been this transference of control. When I was an analog marketing director, it was all about creating an idea, owning that idea, sculpting the idea, inviting people into our store but in an intimidating way. You're inviting them into your world, this world of jet sets and elites and Monaco and yachts, but it's very much on your terms. You're not necessarily welcome, you're invited in, but you're not part of the gang. I mean, that's completely changed now. We used to do huge amounts of work with Karl Lagerfeld. He used to be in our studio a lot. And I remember Karl talking to me, or Mr. Lagerfeld, talking to me about how he created his name, telling women what to wear, how to wear it, and when to wear it. And that's absolutely true, right? But 10 or 20 years ago, okay, but now that just sounds odd, doesn't it? Some old guy telling you what to wear. The influence is on you and the people you influence. It's not about one brand. It's not about one person. It's a wide range of different styles. And the styles come from social media, but it comes from your friends, and it may come from people that we've worked with, like Alexander McQueen and, yes, Karl Lagerfeld. But that kind of melting pot means that we're all thoroughly individual. And I think what's interesting for us about technology is how there are a whole number of tools now that allow you to express that individuality. So tech forced these brands to release a lot of that control to you. And I do remember about 12 years ago doing work with L'Oreal, and their marketing director told me that they'd just discovered that there was a teen influencer based in Kentucky, and that influencer spoke only about L'Oreal products, and she had more followers on social media than L'Oreal did, and they just simply could not get their mind around it. What an incredible new world you guys are helping to create. There were one or two people in luxury that saw things differently. Anna mentioned we do a lot of work with Hermès. The creative director of Hermès is a gentleman called Pierre-Alexis Dumas. I encourage you all to look at him and listen to the way he talks about technology, but the way he talks about craftsmanship, the way he talks about his brand. One of the reasons I started Holition was I heard him speak at a conference in Paris about in the middle of the 1990s, and the conference was only for luxury chief executives, marketing directors. I was a managing director at a brand called De Beers in those days. And he stood on stage and he said something that was truly fascinating for the audience, again, analog audience. He said that when he looks at Hermès product in an Hermès store, he did not believe that those products expressed the brand. And in those days, if your products in your store were not the epitome of your brand, then what on earth was? And he was talking about looking at a row of ties on a point of sale and thinking that those ties looked like soldiers, no personality, just a row of products. And what he was interested in was not the idea of selling the products, but what happened when real people bought those products and took them out into the real world and did things with them. And he was fascinated with the idea of Hermès as an instigator of stories, and that the story only started once the consumer had left the store, whereas every other brand thought the story ended when they'd sold it. Hermès saw it as completely the opposite. They still do. They're an amazing brand. And he created this notion of J'ai mon carré, I love my scarf. He encouraged people to send photographs of themselves wearing Hermès scarves. He put them on a website. It was the 1990s, it was luxury, so only the beautiful people got on the site. But it was the forerunner of Pinterest, it was the forerunner of Instagram, it was the forerunner of many of the tools that you use in your day now. He was one of the, in my mind, he was the person that created it first, certainly in the luxury, in the retail space. So technology, so I'm very interested in that idea of technology becoming more human. And that idea of, my head of strategy, Dr. Anna Mutino, she talks about the really, really powerful technologies, the ones that really shape our lives, they disappear. A lot of technologists talk about technology as something that stands alone. The self-driving car, the new Apple Pro Vision headset. What is interesting about the powerful technology, and I'm thinking particularly about things like the mobile phone in my back pocket, you don't think about them. It's maybe the last thing you see before you go to bed. Maybe it's the first thing you see when you wake up. But it's a little window into the way you learn about the world. And yes, algorithms and echo chambers and good stuff and bad stuff, I get all of that. But I use my phone to interact with the world. It's the window through which I learn about the world, not just in terms of rational, but also in terms of emotional, the important bit of emotional. I follow friends on social media. I get a sense of how they're feeling. They do the same for me. It's a rounded personality, and that is, I think, what is really interesting about the work that you guys do. You're using a piece of technology that folds seamlessly into your consumers. That's interesting to me, and that's been the kind of tipping point, I guess, of the way that technology has continued to evolve and become more and more human. When we think about Web 1, the emergence of the website in 1990s, the brands that we were working with used it to put a location of a store, opening hours, and a phone number to bring up to organize a kind of visit to that store. It was very two-dimensional and it was very rational. Websites were about information only. Round about the 2000s, Web 2 came out, and that started to democratize the web because suddenly there were tools now like user-generated content that enabled and empowered social media and the sort of tools that kind of you use. So it was still 2D, but it was emotional. You could find love on the internet using a mobile phone. You don't have to just go to somewhere. You can see what people are talking about it. You can get a sense of the feeling of a place. It isn't just the streets, the hotels, the locations. And again, that's interesting. And now we're into the world of Web 3. And Web 3, the aim is to democratize the web, to allow you and your consumers to build the kinds of tools that only the Facebooks and the Googles and the Apples could build. NFTs, metaverse ideas, all of this now in theory is within the ability of you to create on your mobile phone. That generation now is moving from rational to emotional and from two-dimensional to three-dimensional. And as we start thinking about a future space, maybe a Mark Zuckerberg space, God forbid, but something that is more immersive and more three-dimensional, but it's also more emotional. And the more emotional it gets, the more interesting it gets, because the deeper it is, the more powerful it is. One of the people that we follow a lot, I'm sure many of you know him, but he's a guy called Scott Galloway, Professor Scott Galloway. He's a professor of business at New York University. He's got a wonderfully cynical view on technology, and one of his earliest lectures that he gave, and it's really good. Look at it on YouTube. It's a TED Talk. It's had absolutely millions and millions of views. But he started to apply technology companies to the body. So he talked about Google being the brain. You interrogate the brain. You learn about answers. You learn about the world through Google, through your brain. He talked about Facebook being the heart. He talked about the idea of we all need to feel like we're part of something. The more friends we have, the more valued we feel. That's Facebook through and through. And then he talked about Apple, and I'm not going to get too crude here, but he talked about Apple being down here. Like, if you have an Apple product, you're a successful person, the premium that it attracts. He was starting to try and, you're a good person to mate with, basically. And that kind of idea of like trying to look at technology as fitting itself into parts of the human psyche is, again, something that is very, very interesting. One of the things I just want to sort of finish off with is we're talking a little bit about the sort of where the kind of tools that you will be using in the future. And we talked about the metaverse and yes, fashion seems to have moved away from the metaverse, but they've moved away from the metaverse. It hasn't even existed yet, so I'm not quite sure how. Little tip to any of you that want to start things up, don't start up in the fashion world, because fashion is all about reinvention, it's all about newness, and it's all about change. And so we can build something that's incredible, and by the time we've released it, rather than scale it, fashion's moved on to something else. So if you look at fashion shows, there was a whole holographic thing, there was a whole drone thing, there was a whole AI thing, there was a whole wearable thing. Everything's constantly moving on. But one of the things that is interesting, I think, about the metaverse, and I think this is something that brands are really starting to embrace now over the last 2 or 3 years. When brands start talking to us about building digital activations, whether it's something that fits on social media, or whether it's a fashion show, or whether it's something that ends up in the metaverse, whatever it is, they're starting to think about the core human needs of their consumers in real life. And you can decide, we can describe needs across a variety of different types of metrics, but a very simple one is acquire. We all need to acquire items, artifacts, knowledge in real world. We all want to play and have recreation in the real world. We all want to explore and see what's on the other side of the hill or what's around the corner in the real world. And we all want to connect. We all want to feel that we're not alone in this space, but we have friends and we have tribes and we're part of something bigger. Starting with that, how can we recreate that, or how can we reproduce that in the digital world so that the digital world is not seen as being something that's separate, but something that's joined? And as human beings, we have a foot in each of them. And what is the role of the digital world? Is it a place where we can explore? Is it a place where we can escape? Is it a place where we can try and look at different sides of our personalities, or try new looks, and what happens when we come back into the real world? Do we take those digital ideas back with us? That kind of interplay between the real world and the digital world is a world that most of our brands are starting to look at. And I think that's very interesting. And again, I think it's very interesting for you as influencers. So do think about that. Thank you. Wow.
Thank you. Very interesting. Has the time frame from concept to actually producing something shortened a lot with evolution of technology?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can totally answer that question because the work that we do is so different. I mean, we did a huge fashion show for Dunhill in Shanghai a couple of years ago, and that was 6 months of hard work. But of that 6 months of hard work, 3 months was just messing around, thinking of ideas. Another month was spent looking for a location. And then it was about 6 weeks of blind panic as we tried to get everything together. AI is obviously changing something. One of the things that's fascinating about AI, or maybe terrifying about AI, is we're using AI to develop code. So you can plug code into a chatbot, basically, to Claude or to ChatGPT, and ask it to write code. So it's not very good at it, but of code blocks, probably 90% of code is, bricks and mortar, the same bricks and mortar, and it's the 10% on top that does the magic. So we can start building things much faster. I think another thing is in the early days, I think brands kind of recognized that building new stuff took time. They were very used to photographic shoots that could happen in an afternoon. So they recognized that we could shoot an ad campaign quite quickly, but building something using technology took time. I think their patience has worn thin. So we're under more and more pressure now to build things quickly. And I think obviously that's a mistake because all of that comes down on us. But I think they also miss the fundamental fact that they look at technology as something that stands completely alone. Whereas technology is never something that stands alone. The iPhone started with an iPhone 1 and we're on to iPhone 15. Whether it's an airplane, a computer, a television, a car, the ones at the beginning of the evolution of those items are fundamentally different to what they are now. So it's not so much can we build things quicker, it's can we keep improving something to the point where a client will accept it. Louis Vuitton doesn't launch a handbag that is missing its clasp. It's used to a finite finished object, whereas technology doesn't work that way. It's constantly getting better. It is. So one of the things we try and do is borrow from big tech like Google and do things in sprints. So we'll commit to build the handle of the handbag, and then we'll commit to building the clasp, and then we'll try and so they feel like they're getting little deliverables, although actually they're not.
It's funny because I appreciated the amount of work involved by actually going to a studio like yours and watching an artist, digital artist work.
Yeah.
So for me, it's almost like if a client is demanding something,
We talk about digital craftsmanship and things such as that, but I mean, we can turn things around very fast. We were commissioned by the British Fashion Council to do something around mental health at London Fashion Week. They wanted something that could be worn on a catwalk, and they wanted to. It was that awful year when poor Kate Spade took her own life, and there was constant conversations around abuse of models and stress and just kind of dark stories coming out. And the British Fashion Council wanted to talk about it. And there was no brief other than, can you build us something? And so we built a dress, and the dress scans the mind of the wearer in real time and uses that information to understand their mood and emotion, and then changes colors and patternation according to how you feel. So you're literally wearing your heart on your sleeve. And it was worn on a catwalk and had great coverage, and allowed the British Fashion Council to get into that conversation. For us, we did it for three reasons. One, it was commissioned, but secondly, a very good friend of the studio had a stroke and was paralyzed from the neck down and couldn't speak. We wanted to see whether we could use fashion to give a voice back to people that can't communicate using, the way that we all communicate. But also, we wanted to talk about privacy, because lots of people wore the dress and felt deeply uncomfortable showing the world how they feel. But on social media, quite happily talking about they're having a miserable day or whatever, and why do we feel like we can emote more to strangers digitally than we can face to face? I mean, maybe you agree, maybe you don't, but it's just an interesting juxtaposition there. Yeah. So shouting from the rooftops rather than face to face. We're okay to shout from the rooftops, but we don't like it face to face. I don't know.
What can we do to help the situation in the studio?
Well, wine works very well. That's my job. My job is just to keep the team lubricated and fed. So I will go back at some point and give them pizzas and buy them beers and put an arm around their shoulders and give them a cuddle. But actually, again, if you start your own business, whenever this finishes, and it will finish inevitably at some point, I won't think about the projects. I'll think about the people. Hey.
My question was, with the whole rise of AI, obviously there are so many benefits to it and how, increasing efficiency and all sorts. But I think in the creative industry, one of the main drawbacks is it affects human creative authenticity. How do you think we can navigate that, or what are the things that we could do in the creative industry to reduce, how do I say it, to preserve our authenticity?
So that's a great question, a really good question, and I don't have a really great answer to it. I mean, one of the things I would say is, a bit like the atomic bomb, you can't disinvent it. It's here, and it's going to get more and more and more. The question more is how are we going to deal with it? How are we going to live with it? One of the things I think is interesting about mobile phones is we all take a lot of photographs, but we're not all great photographers. So I'm hoping, and maybe I'm being very naive here, I accept it, but I'm hoping that some of these tools are tools. How do we as humans use it? That's where the creative comes in. That's where the ideas come in. So there is inevitably going to be a kind of mashup where we're all creative people now and we use these tools. But I can remember going back to Karl Lagerfeld. I remember getting into a furious argument with him because there was a lot of conversation around the fact that, and it's not happened, but few years ago, everyone was talking about 3D printing your own clothes. And I was saying it's only a matter of time before you can design your clothes on your phone, and now you can print them in your kitchen. I mean, the inference was what's the point of you, Mr. Lagerfeld? Because we're all designers. And actually, he was very good. He said, look, we're all designers, yeah, but we're not all great designers. We're not all Karl Lagerfelds. And if we all are designers, then what will happen is that the world will go grey. And actually what you want is people that inspire and create light. and therefore the good ones will use these tools to do incredible things. But I am aware it's a slightly trite answer, because I think, as Peter Parker once said, with great power comes great responsibility, and I'm not quite sure we're mature enough as individuals to be able to cope with that responsibility quite yet.